Hello everyone, my name is Willeke Rijn, CEO of the Resource Alliance, and I'm very happy to ask some questions and have a conversation with Ingrid Srinath. Ingrid Srinath has been the CEO of CRY in India, of Civic, and the founder of the Center for Social Impact and Philanthropy, linked to the Ashoka University in India. Welcome, Ingrid.
Thank you, Willeke. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and Ingrid is also on the board of the Resource Alliance, which you are very happy and grateful with. Ingrid, I want to talk with you about shrinking of civic space. Can you a little bit explain to us what does that mean and what is the impact that you're seeing?
So broadly, it's describing a phenomenon where it's becoming increasingly difficult for nonprofits, NGOs, civil society organizations of various kinds to pursue their missions because they are being hemmed in by increasing regulatory constraints of various kinds, but also beyond regulatory constraints, also being targeted in other ways through intimidation, through a sort of what we call a chilling effect, where any kind of dissent is being criminalized, and people are paying very high prices for speaking up or speaking out or criticizing governments, their policies, or for that matter, business and their policies. So you have different forms. There's the first and most obvious one typically takes the form of restrictions on international funding. There's also coupled with that a sort of a demonizing of international funders. So, the very fact that you receive international funding is somehow used to label you as a foreign agent or as a anti-national, and then the number of conditionalities being placed on being able to receive foreign money get worse and worse every year. But besides that, for example, there are income tax regulations, so whether you can claim a tax exemption or not, and what the qualifications for that are, and then things like incentives to donors to not fund certain kinds of works, or disincentives to funding human rights work, for example, or environmental work. And so in the Indian case, we have this large pool of money that's generated from corporate social responsibility, which is mandatory in India. But the list of things that you're allowed to fund under that regulation is limited to these items that are all apolitical and intolerant of anything that's even vaguely critical of policies or government. So there's regulations, but as I said, there's also intimidation. So offline and online, you have threats and trolling. You have the risk of losing your tax exemption. You have, in the worst cases, your family, your reputation, your bank accounts being frozen. You're literally labeled a criminal without ever being charged with anything, or without ever being brought to trial. And so you have your reputation. If your freedom to travel, for example, your passport gets seized or revoked. So there's a number of different measures that governments are taking to restrict civil society action.
Thanks. You are mentioning about a topic about the limitation or sometimes even the restriction of international funding. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the implications are and what that really means?
So this takes different forms in different countries, but in the main what it does is it restricts NGOs' right, and this is a right under international law, to receive resources, to have the freedom to receive resources. And the only conditions under which governments are allowed to restrict them is for reasons of national security, for example. But they have used the threat of terrorism and national security to create these very wide and sweeping sort of restrictions that prevent organizations from receiving money. And that then allows them to pick and choose which organizations can get money and which can't. So in India, what this means is every 5 years, you have to apply to have your license to receive foreign funding renewed. And there's a almost forensic kind of audit of your programs. Your board members are interviewed. They want to have your identity details for everyone that's associated, which is, it's also a deterrent to people even wanting to serve on boards.
Yeah.
Why would I want my whole personal history to be sitting in a file in a government office just in order to have the privilege of serving on a board?
Yeah.
And so what it allows them to do then is to direct foreign funding into those ends that the government thinks is okay. So they're fine with a foundation funding, an international foundation funding the anti-HIV/AIDS program in your country or a malnutrition program. But they're not okay with that money going to help communities that are being displaced by extractive industries. Or they're not okay with that going to organizations that are doing research into the impact of government policies, and so on, or human rights defenders. So there's a bunch of things. It essentially allows them to define what they think is good civil society versus unacceptable civil society.
Could you give us an example of what is happening and what the impact is for a civil society organization?
So there are some forms of work that are just impossible to do now. If I think of most human rights defending work in India, the government will not allow those organizations to receive foreign money. But once you're perceived even to be out of favor with the government, then domestic funders also will want to keep their distance because they don't want to risk being associated with someone who's thought of as anti-national. And so you very quickly essentially run out of funds and have to either constrain your programs to very limited scope or shut them down altogether. The international NGOs in particular have come under a fair amount of targeting. So you have everyone from Greenpeace, Amnesty, Oxfam, Save the Children, CARE, you name it. I mean, there's the who's who of international NGOs in there that have had their license to receive money revoked. What this means is for most of them, their program budgets in India have shrunk by about 60-70%. So they're not being able to keep staff, they're having to downsize staffing and programs, and essentially sort of become a sort of skeletal operation that has very, very limited scope for doing anything significant. The same goes for policy analysis outfits, think tanks, educational institutions. It's the whole range of organizations that find themselves less and less able to fulfill their missions.
And you're also mentioning already about the topic around board and, the questioning of, do you want to serve on the board? But also that instability in funding potential. Do you want to work in civil society when you do not know if your job is still surviving the day after tomorrow?
So I've had staff members be questioned by the people they rent their flats from.
Wow.
To say, "Oh, you work at that NGO. Is that one of those that is in disfavor with the government?" Because the landlady in this case is apprehensive about her renter's ability to pay the rent, or she's worried that she might become guilty by association by housing this person. People have had difficulty getting bank loans. They're like, "Ooh, you work for that organization. We're not sure you're a good credit risk." In a country like India, where we have arranged marriages, even your marriage prospects will be diminished by the fact that you work for this organization that the government doesn't like.
Yeah. Do you sense that also with people? Are they really wondering, is this still an option for me, or are they even more driven?
Well, I'm actually quite amazed by people's courage.
Yeah.
I think in the main, people, civil society activists and the people that work at NGOs have really put on a fantastically brave resistance to, as much as they could, to this. What has not been the case is the same levels of courage from Indian philanthropy and Indian business and Indian media for that matter.
Can you tell us more about that? What is happening with the local philanthropy?
So there are very, very few philanthropists, probably not even the fingers of one hand, who are still willing to fund work that addresses root causes, that takes a rights-based approach, that does advocacy and campaigning as one of their strategies, that works with certain communities. And so as long as you're delivering a sort of sanitized program, you know, as long as you're feeding children or immunizing people or delivering microcredit or doing that sort of stuff, service delivery, plugging the gaps in government public services without asking the question, why don't these services exist? Or why do these gaps exist? Then you're okay. Whereas as soon as you start to ask the question, oh, but why do we need private funding for these? Why isn't this an entitlement? Or why are these people being left out? Or why is this program not delivering what it's supposed to? At that point, you know, you become a risky prospect for funding. I mean, I've had philanthropists say things like, we don't use the phrase human rights anymore. Recently, I was told we don't use the phrase social justice anymore. So there's this self-censorship that's happening. And it's not unreasonable, Willeke. I mean, because philanthropists who have tried to do this have been visited with consequences. I mean, they've had income tax raids. They've had the ominous phone call from somebody in a senior position saying, you know, you want to think about this. And because you depend on government for so many things, you know, from your right to do business to anything, should they choose to harass you, there are many, many different forms of that harassment can take. And because you don't, you know, you can go to court about them. NGOs have gone to court. Every NGO that has gone to court has won. There is not a single case of an NGO that has challenged these restrictions in court and not won. But in the process, I mean, it's taken you 5, 7, 10 years to get that victory, by which time your operations have wound down, your staff has had to be let go, and you might as well, you know, it's a very Pyrrhic victory. Yeah,
and we're talking there a lot about the dependency on funding and the swap to, you know, local philanthropy and getting alternative income sources. What are the potentials there in India? I mean, 60-70% decline in income, that's impossible to bridge overnight. That takes time, that takes, you know, new techniques, new setups, and actually sometimes upfront investments in a way as well, which you don't have available. How do you see that?
So I think organizations are trying to cope in different ways. Some are sort of restructuring themselves so that rather than staff being employed by the INGO, for example, they're now employed by the partner. And the grant, instead of coming through the national organization, comes directly to the partner. So there are some coping mechanisms. Some have tried the route of setting up private limited companies and then found themselves in even worse trouble than they would have been if they had just stayed non-profits. So people have tried different coping mechanisms. None of them are durable. I mean, you know, as soon as somebody finds a loophole, the government is going to close it. And the consequences of exploiting that loophole are actually going to be worse than if you just trodden the straight and narrow in the first place. So really, possibly the only viable strategy is to raise your money from the public, because that is impossible to shut down or much harder to shut down. And so organizations that have been able to adapt in that way are probably the only ones that are being able somehow to continue operating.